Okay, so here are the answers to the questions at the end of the previous chapter. So why don't you pause the video while you tick them off, and you can carry on with the next chapter, which is energy and biomass in food chains. Energy from the sun. Green plants and algae use energy from the sun in photosynthesis. This light energy is stored in the chemicals that make up the cells of the plants, and this material is known as biomass. Biomass. Now, this is the mass of living material at each stage of a food chain. It can be shown to scale as a pyramid of biomass, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, the biomass at any stage of a food chain is less than it was at the previous stage. The amount of biomass goes down as you go through a food chain. And this is because, and here's a key term, energy and materials are lost at each stage. Reasons for that? Well, not all of the organism gets eaten. So, for example, fur and feathers don't get eaten. So that biomass from that dead fox or that dead bird or whatever doesn't get passed through the food chain. Energy and materials are also lost as waste materials, for example as feces and urine and as CO2. And in the exam, be specific when you're talking about biomass. Energy and materials are lost at each stage of a food chain. They're lost as waste materials. Be specific. Say they're lost as feces and urine and as CO2. And if the question's about energy, then energy is released by respiration, not used by respiration. It's released by respiration. And it's used for movement, heat, muscle contraction, whatever. And then it's eventually lost to the surroundings. Here's a pyramid of biomass drawn to scale. You'll see that the plant, the producer, is always at the bottom. It's then eaten by the herbivore, the rabbit, which is then eaten by the carnivore, the fox. And you'll notice that it's always pyramid shaped. The base is always the widest point. Now, pyramids of biomass are always pyramid shaped, as in widest at the bottom. But there's one exception. At certain times of the year, certain organisms, such as plant plankton, which multiply very rapidly, may have less biomass than the organisms which feed on them. But that's one exception. All the materials from living things are eventually returned to the environment, either as waste materials from the living organism, or when the living things die and decay. These materials are broken down by microorganisms. This decay releases substances into the soil for use by plants. The microbes decay materials fastest in warm, moist, aerobic, that means oxygenated, conditions. All the materials are constantly cycled. The carbon cycle. Carbon is taken up by plants and algae in photosynthesis, and this becomes carbohydrates, fats and proteins in plant and algal cells. The plants and algae respire, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, or they're eaten by animals, becoming carbohydrates, fats and proteins in the animal cells, and the animals respire and release CO2 into the atmosphere. So why do I keep going on about plants and algae? What are algae? Well, they're photosynthesizers. Algae are microscopic photosynthesizing organisms. They're tiny, single-celled photosynthesizing organisms. So for example, you might see them in pond water. They just make pond water look slightly greenish in colour. Or you might see them on tree bark. It makes tree bark look a bit greenish and slimy. They're huge photosynthesizers, so therefore they play a part in the carbon cycle. So the plants and animals may die and decompose, And the decomposers, that's the microbes, they respire and release CO2 into the atmosphere. Now what they absolutely don't do is eat or consume the material. So don't use those terms. The decomposers respire. They don't do anything else. And then of course the plant and animal material may fossilise, and so the combustion of fossil fuels or wood releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So in case you didn't notice it, you have to refer to respiration in any question about carbon cycle. The plants, the algal cells and the animals respire, the decomposers respire, and in doing so they release CO2 into the atmosphere. So here's the summary of the carbon cycle. If you start on the left, CO2 is absorbed by the plants in photosynthesis. Then three things can happen to it. The plants can die, they can get eaten, or the plants will respire. If they respire, CO2 is released. If they're eaten, it goes into the animals and the animals respire and CO2 is released. If they die, they're gobbled up by the microbes, by the decomposers, and they respire and CO2 is released. When anything dies, it's decomposed, the microbes respire and CO2 is released. Or the dead plants and animals become fossil fuels, and then they're combusted. When we eventually burn them, they release CO2. Don't forget, there's a lot of CO2 dissolved in the oceans. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter. Hopefully you've printed off all the notes so you can have a go at these questions now. You'll find the answers at the beginning of the next chapter. Good luck!